Welcome to Micro Bytes. I'm Rich Bowers, and today we're going to be talking about imposter syndrome. And I couldn't think of a better expert to bring in than Sierra White, who a lot of our listeners may know from our discussions on digital mindset earlier in this series. But good morning, Sierra. How are you doing?
Good morning. I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. And with your experience as the manager of corporate coaching, I think this topic is probably really familiar for you. So, kind of starting off our discussion, some people may not have heard of imposter syndrome or maybe even have had it, but didn't realize that there's some things that you could do to overcome it. Let's start with the definition of imposter syndrome. From your expertise, what is imposter syndrome?
Right. So, imposter syndrome to me, and there's a lot of different technical definitions of what imposter syndrome is, but overall, it's really just the struggle to believe that you really don't deserve your success or that it's genuinely a result of your own efforts or skills. So, a little bit of a lack of confidence can cause imposter syndrome. It can really stem from a lot of different areas. It can stem from social expectations or being a perfectionist or even with your upbringing. So it can stem from a lot of different places, but it's really just not fully believing in your skills and really in your success.
Great definition. And so it's important to pinpoint though when you're mentioning that they're not believing in their success, their skills. But in reality, with imposter syndrome, the word imposter might give it away. You're saying that they actually earned their spot and they're still doubting their own capabilities, though they clearly have it. Is that correct?
Yes, that's the case. It's something that you do have what it takes. You have kind of the work to show that you are, in fact, that valued person that you just maybe don't see. And I just really think usually just stems from a lack of confidence in one area or another. But I think it's so important to find out where that specifically comes from.
It's an interesting feeling and topic. Is this common in the workplace?
It really is. So it's interesting because throughout all my research I've done on imposter syndrome, the Harvard Business Review says that 70% of people experience it. The Forbes article says 82% of people experience it. But I've actually seen with working with individuals from entry level individuals to senior individuals that I think it's really more 90% of people in terms of who I've interacted with. And honestly, the other 10 people just probably don't know what it is enough to actually think that they have experienced it at one point, because I think it's kind of inevitable, whether you're starting a brand new job or starting a position, you may have that self-doubt from time to time just because you're nervous. You want to do everything perfect. And sometimes you may think that everything that you're doing isn't as perfect as you expected it to be.
Right. So a couple things to pull from that. When you're mentioning that with the statistics, right? 70 to 90% of people experience it. And it could be for any type of job. So you're saying that this occurs, you as a corporate coach who's worked with not only junior level, mid level, senior level, executive level, et cetera. You've seen this occur at every single step along the way.
Yes. And some people may think it's just entry level individuals who have that self doubt or lack of confidence because they're brand new to the company, the field, they're the new person on the team. But that's not, in fact, true. I've seen it working with senior individuals when they're potentially going to present a big project to executives. Going into that project or going into that presentation, there's a little bit of that lack of confidence sometimes when maybe their presentation's amazing and it's just, okay, well, I don't really believe it's as amazing as it should be being presented to these executives. And it can just be that intimidation of these people are higher than me. And what I think is really important to remember in that situation is they're people just like me and
Right.
you. Being at a higher level doesn't really mean anything in terms of why you should be less confident in yourself.
And would you say sometimes I know you mentioned, let's say they're doing a presentation to a higher level, a bigger fish in the ocean, so to speak. Do you feel like it can go the other way too, where sometimes the higher level individuals have imposter syndrome about the capabilities of managing the team below them?
Oh, yeah. I think that that's definitely the case because when sometimes when you go into a management position, I've seen that basically people sometimes think if you're good at the job that you can manage other individuals doing that job. And that's not the case. Being a manager is a whole different skill than just being good at your job. So sometimes it can be a little hard to navigate having different personalities on a team, different skill sets on a team, and bringing those all together. And then, yes, that can cause that when you see one teammate falling behind, it can be a thought process of what am I not doing? What is that person not getting that's my fault? So, yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen that as well.
And then the thought process is, instead of saying, hey, how can I learn about this or overcome it, which we'll talk about shortly, is I just can't do it. Somebody's better than me for this job, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay. So we kind of have that. Let's talk about the challenges, right? We both you and I have spoken with others who said, hey, look, imposter syndrome is a good thing. I think you and I are on the same boat that says, no, we want to get rid of that swiftly. So let's talk about the downside. What are the challenges or even consequences that come if imposter syndrome truly just overwhelms somebody?
Right. I think with imposter syndrome, the biggest thing I've seen with it is it just causes a massive lack of confidence. And I know I've mentioned that earlier, but that is really where imposter syndrome stems from. Because if you're confident in your abilities, you're not going to feel like an imposter. Like you said, it's in the name. So I think really the biggest challenge is not having that confidence and not feeling like you haven't earned or achieved your skills. With that lack of confidence that you may have, that can then cause a drop in your performance when you're working because you're just not believing in yourself. With that drop of performance, that can also then start to affect the mental health side, causing anxiety about not being good enough. And then you're so focused on being anxious about not being good enough that you kind of lose sight of what the actual task at hand was. Another thing I've seen challenges with is really just causing an effect in your friendships, relationships. It can really feel like you're not able to be as open with people when you feel like an imposter yourself. There's kind of a guard up. And then again, that can also be a hindrance in people trying to help you out because you're not really being your authentic self to them as well. So there's a few different things I feel. And with all those factors, sometimes it can really cause you to just burn out because you are focused on so many negatives emotions that you're not trying to really see that light at the end of the tunnel. That can kind of be a blanket on top of everything else good that is going on.
And that's such an excellent point that you made, and kind of a correlation, so to speak, is if it's taking over your work mentality, it is going to trickle into at home, especially when it becomes more of a mental health thing, as you mentioned there. And I think maybe it's an important question to ask. You mentioned in the beginning, it kind of chips away at confidence,
Right.
right? This could happen with anybody, even somebody that you say, hey, he or she is the most confident individual in the world. What can knock them down, from there, right? This can happen to anybody, though someone's a top individual performer, as an example, or even a great manager at times. No matter what, this can impact even a confidence level, correct?
Definitely. I think a big misconception with imposter syndrome is it is not who you are. It's really just something that people experience from time to time. So you can experience imposter syndrome just on one project and then you can be good, for the rest of your life. It's not something that you can't identify as having imposter syndrome for the rest of your life. There's a few things that I really like to point out to overcome imposter syndrome, but it can happen to anyone. And I always love to share with individuals that tell me through my coaching that they're experiencing imposter syndrome is the most confident person the person that you look up to and strive to be. I guarantee you they have experienced imposter syndrome at one point or another. And that's always good to help in terms of perception of everyone experiences it. It's very normal. It's very common. And even those most confident people are just like you. They experience those moments of self-doubt.
And I want to go into that the coaching experience that you have, but before then, you actually brought up a point that I was curious about. Imposter syndrome, you just mentioned, could last maybe for one project. So you're telling me there's no definition of time that imposter syndrome typically lasts, or when it could spring up, or when it could fall back, right? It could be short, long, midterm, whatever it may be.
Correct. And I think what that is really dependent on is how you approach imposter syndrome. Because if you are someone who's just saying, I have imposter syndrome, and you're not trying to fix it, yes, you will have it a little bit longer. But if you are someone that really likes to tackle your challenges by saying, I'm feeling a little bit of imposter syndrome with this situation, how can I improve it? Then yes, it may only be for one project. So I think the big determining factor of how long it lasts is how you approach it and how you handle the situation.
Well, we have a SME right in front of me here. Tell us how to get out of that, right? So being a corporate coach, what strategies or techniques can individuals use to recognize and overcome this?
So, with approaches, I think the biggest thing to do here to start overcoming imposter syndrome, and as a coach, I always really love to, when I'm coaching individuals, find out the issue, but then instantly put together an action plan of how do we fix this? Instead of dwelling in that negative emotional state that you're in, I instantly like to come up with a solution. So, my first step here is always going to be self evaluation. Now, with kind of self diagnosing yourself with anything such as imposter syndrome, it's important to know what exactly it is. So, with imposter syndrome, if you look into it, technically, there are 5 types of imposter syndrome, and this is something I recommend all our listeners to look up and do a little bit more research in. But there's the perfectionist, the superhuman, the natural genius, the soloist, and the expert. So once you find out specifically where your imposter syndrome is stemming from, and some people are 1 out of 5, some people are 3 out of 5. But again, it's good to see a little bit of, okay, well, where does this stem from? And then once you can find out where it stems from, then you can tackle that a little bit deeper. So, what has caused you to feel this imposter syndrome? What characteristics do you feel maybe not the most confident in? What has confirmed these beliefs for you? And during what activity specifically do you feel this imposter syndrome? So once you can narrow that down, and I'm a big advocate for writing all your problems down on paper. It's way easier to solve when they're on paper instead of just all floating in your head. Once you can find out the root cause, then you can start going into some best practices because something different will work for everyone. But it's so important, first and foremost, to really find the root cause of the issue.
Okay, great starting point then. So, Sierra, do you mind mentioning those 5 types again? I actually haven't heard too much about all 5 of those. Do you mind listing those again?
Yeah, definitely. So the 5 types of imposter syndrome, first are the perfectionist, second is the superhuman, third is the natural genius, fourth is the soloist, and then fifth is the expert. So when you do some research and look into each of those, it is something where it kind of describes a personality type. I'm sure we've all taken those personality tests where you get those random letters that describe you as a person. This is kind of the same thing. And it really helps when you're reading this. You may never have realized, okay, I'm a perfectionist. But then when you read the description, you're like, yeah, I'm definitely a perfectionist. I need everything to go right. If one thing goes wrong, I can't function without that being right. So it's good to really see, okay, well, I didn't even realize this is who I am. Now I realize how this may be an issue.
Excellent. And something to look up, obviously to dive in there because then you'll be able to establish a game plan.
Right.
I think one of the things when I've interacted with people who have this, do they realize that they have this? Is kind of one of my thoughts because it's just a pure doubt of just they think it's an inability. Right. Have you found that people don't recognize that they have this right off the bat?
It's interesting because as a coach, I've seen so many different types of people and so many different types of personalities. So sometimes I will experience someone who has never even heard of imposter syndrome, is completely unaware that they have this. Other times I'll run into people that just say, yep, I have imposter syndrome. And sometimes almost use it as an excuse, which I'm a very big, problem and solution type of person. So I'm always like, okay, well, if you have imposter syndrome, what are you doing to overcome it? So it's a very 50-50 where some people do know that they have it and sometimes just aren't working to improve it. And I can definitely share some further steps on what I recommend in that situation of how to start overcoming it, just some little things there. But then otherwise, if people are unaware that they have it, that is really when I recommend look into what imposter syndrome is, really see out of the 5 types of imposter syndrome which you are. So then we can get to that second layer of some best practices to help.
Cool. And Jen, that's just another great advantage of having a mentor, a coach, right? Someone who can guide you in those areas that say, hey, look, I recognize what this is, or help you out along the way, because you may not realize it, or you may misclarify it, really, right? So, okay, cool. So you mentioned you have a few steps to overcome it. What are some practices that you recommend then, continuing on that?
So kind of stemming off of your point of having a mentor, that's one of my biggest things is find someone that you would like to emulate, whether this is a friend that's in the field, maybe it's someone in your company that's not even on your team, but you always looked up to them, someone that you strive to be. Find a mentor, interview them, see how they've gotten to their position. You'll probably realize it's a lot more work than you anticipated it to be to get to that top level, but it's a great starting point to see how much it does take to become that person. A few other things I recommend is really keeping a positive mindset. And that can look different for every single person, whether it's positive self-talk, listening to podcasts. One of my favorite is watching TED Talks. Those are always extremely motivational. Another big thing I look at is writing down your accomplishments. And this can be from anything. This can be your degree. This can be past job experiences. This can be in your hobbies or maybe even in sports. Whatever you are confident in, write that down. And that can be a big boost of motivation when you look at this list of accomplishments and you're like, wow, I'm actually pretty great. After you look at all these accomplishments that you've written down, that is such a big motivating factor to push through whatever you're starting. You may think if you got your college degree, your first day of freshman year, you may have thought, wow, this is going to be impossible, but you did it. So that's something that I always am such a huge advocate for is look at your successes. You're here for a reason and really take credit and don't sell yourself short on everything that you have done to get to this point. I do think, lastly, something I love so much is to constantly learn. If you are getting better and better and growing yourself as a person, you kind of can't doubt yourself. If you look back 3 months ago and you say, wow, I know 3 major topics that I didn't know 3 months ago, that's a big boost in your confidence where you know that you're constantly getting better and you're growing. And this can help because now you know, okay, well, sometimes it takes time to grow, but I will slowly get better. So constantly learning is another big thing that I always recommend. And I'll have people write down monthly goals of, okay, well, what are you planning at getting better this month? So you can keep track and make sure that people are, in fact, doing what they're saying they're going to do with improving.
I love that list. I love that list. And speaking from somebody who certainly has had imposter syndrome in the past myself, my first step was one of those that you mentioned was recognizing past achievements, right? Realizing that you're in that seat for a reason and that you earned it. So I really love all of those, extremely valuable that you just shared those. Sia, I know, as we're getting a little bit closer to time here, this is one that I was curious about. We have a variety of different listeners here from all levels. And imposter syndrome helps out, or impacts everybody, and this conversation will help out there. But are there any specific factors or conditions within typical corporate environments that tend to exacerbate imposter syndrome?
Yeah, I think a really big area is specifically when people are joining a brand new team. And this can really help with leaders and managers, kind of managing those new junior developers on their team or junior entry level employees. I think such a big situation that I have seen is usually people brand new to any level are going to experience imposter syndrome. So I think it's good for future leaders or current leaders and managers to almost assume that those new joiners have imposter syndrome. That way you can approach that in a whole different situation. So when there is a junior person on the team, a lot of times people assume that they're less knowledgeable than everyone else on the team because they're new, when that may not be the case. They may have knowledge that no one else does have on a team. So I think something that I always recommend in looking in the corporate environment to leaders specifically is approach that person as they have imposter syndrome. And you want to really shout out their accomplishments when they are brand new to start building up their confidence level at a very low level. The second that they join, build up their confidence because they are looking to you for guidance, and you're kind of their built-in mentor. So that's something I usually do see is at that leadership level to approach everyone sometimes. Like they have imposter syndrome, so you can start building their confidence, and it's going to be a benefit for them because when they're building their confidence day after day, they're going to become a confident person because they have instilled that confidence in them, which of course will result to better work, which is kind of just a bonus on their end as well.
That's unique. I actually haven't heard that approach from managers to those below them. Do you think that one of the challenges in corporate environments right now are that managers just assume that person will get over it? Is that why you're saying this?
I do think so. I do think that managers sometimes look at new employees and think, well, they're just new. In 2 months, they'll, like you said, get over it. And that's not always the case because if that is the approach, sometimes it can come across as managers are disappointed in them when there isn't that support, when it's just like, you're kind of messing up in the beginning, but you'll eventually get over it. If there isn't that discussion of, what can I help with? Is there something that you're lacking that I can support you with? Then it can just start off without the new entry level employee having that confidence that their manager does in fact believe in them. And of course it's a give and take. The new employee has to reach out to the manager and take initiative on their own, but I think that that's something that, like you said, sometimes is missed, of the leader and the manager instilling that confidence level in that person, because again, that new entry level employee is looking up to them as a mentor, whether they know it or not.
Love that. I think it's important for both sides of the house that are listening, leaders or newer employees or newer people at their role, is they obviously want the newer employees to speak up about their challenges. But from a leader's perspective, you have to realize if these people are going through this self-doubt moment, probably one of the last things they want to do is say, hey, Mrs. Manager, I'm having trouble with this. I don't think I can do this. I don't think I'm the right person for this. Right? Just think about that from that leadership mentality. Is, a lot of great leaders can recognize when this is occurring for their team, or as Sierra mentioned, just assume, even to start, right? Approach it. There's not a challenge that way. Just realize that instead of expecting somebody to come up to you and say, hey, I have imposter syndrome, the real fact is they're already in a self-doubt, a situation where they probably are extremely nervous about their current standing, and so approach them. I think that was great advice. So Sierra, as these are a little bit more of our shorter conversations, I want to kind of wrap up with kind of an open thought to you. Are there any common misconceptions about imposter syndrome that you want to add or clarify or kind of put a bow on here?
Definitely. And I love this question because I think that this is one of the most important things to look at with imposter syndrome. I briefly mentioned it earlier, but this is a great point to end on. I think the biggest misconception about imposter syndrome is that you have imposter syndrome instead of you're experiencing imposter syndrome. I have so many people that sometimes may use it as an excuse. For example, if you look at public speaking and people say, well, I have imposter syndrome, I'm not confident in public speaking, they think that that may be an excuse to never speak in front of crowds. My response when people say, and I remember so clearly, someone came up to me and said, well, I just have imposter syndrome, so I can't really do that. And I said, my response was, okay, well, how have you worked on overcoming imposter syndrome? No response in that. And there is nothing to overcome. So that to me is something I love to stress, is the biggest thing about imposter syndrome is just because you experience it once does not mean that you live with it for the rest of your life and that you will have that for the rest of your life. Once you start looking at it as a simple challenge that you have to overcome, kind of like taking your first steps. You never think that you'll be able to fully run when you're first taking your full steps, but it just naturally happens over time when you're constantly practicing and constantly learning. Once you are able to diagnose yourself with why you have imposter syndrome, the next step has to be, how am I going to overcome it? What am I doing to make myself better? Am I learning? Am I taking classes to improve public speaking? To go back to that example, have I gotten advice with other people? Have I gotten feedback, and not only gotten feedback, but have I taken that into consideration in terms of how to improve with it? that should be the biggest focus, is how am I working to become my best self and gain more confidence and eventually not have imposter syndrome anymore.
Amazing. Amazing. I got to say, this is probably one of our most important discussions that we've had because it does impact everybody at different levels. And, you sharing this valuable insight is going to help others. So, Sierra, with that being said, thank you. I appreciate your expertise. Obviously, you've spent a lot of time helping people out with this, researching it, and providing best strategies. So, this has been great. We're going to pass this along, and I thank you again. So, for Microbytes, I'm Rich Bowers. Take care.